Elimination of Poverty Amongst Indigenous Peoples of Canada. A presentation by Louis Papillon. Before I begin my presentation, let's acknowledge the land that we are on. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional and territorial lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Ojibwe, and Algonquin homelands. We acknowledge that these ancestral lands that we are gathered on, which continue to interconnect us all and remind us that we are all treaty people. First Nation communities now located on these lands include Temagami, Temiskaming, Matachewan, Matagami, Wagoshkig, Tequa, Tagamu, Beaver House, Flying Post, Moose Cree, Fort Albany, Catchewan, Attawapiskat, Wishnuk, and Métis People Region 3. I must sincerely apologize if I have mispronounced any of those names. It was not my intention. In 1998, the United Nations released a statement on poverty titled Statement of Commitment for Action to Eradicate Poverty adopted by Administrative Committee on Coordination. This statement was approved and signed by the heads of all United Nations agencies, and it defined poverty as the following. Fundamentally, poverty is a denial of choices and opportunities, a violation of human dignity. It means a lack of basic capacity to participate effectively in society. Poverty means not having enough to feed or clothe a family, not having a school or clinic to go to, not having the land on which to grow one's food or a job to earn one's living. Poverty means not having access to credit. It means insecurity, powerlessness, and exclusion of individuals, households, and communities. Poverty means susceptibility to violence. It often implies living on marginal or fragile environments, without access to clean water or even sanitation. United Nations, 1998. More recently, in 2022, the United Nations noted on the subject of poverty that more than 700 million people around the world, which means about 10% of the global population, still live in extreme poverty. This means they are surviving on approximately less than $2 a day. The United Nations predicts these figures will continue to rise as a result of the global COVID-19 pandemic, alongside with ongoing impacts of conflicts and climate change. Poverty is more than a lack of income. Poverty has a wide range of different socioeconomic dimensions, including the ability to access services and social protection measures, the ability to express opinions and choices, the ability to negotiate. Poverty also includes social status, decent work opportunities as well. Poverty is also the root cause of many human rights and labor rights violations. For example, child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking are each deeply interconnected to poverty. The COVID-19 pandemic and the confirmation of unmarked graves at former residential school sites all across Canada have brought renewed attention to the long-standing and ongoing socioeconomic inequities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people of this country. Statistics Canada said that these inequities include a higher prevalence of poverty amongst First Nation people, Métis, and Inuit, perpetuated by colonial policies and practices, including barriers to educational and economic opportunities. Based on the figures from the 2016 Canadian Census, Statistics Canada released a study entitled Low Income Statistics for the Population Living on Reserve and in the North using the 2016 Census. The study was a descriptive analysis of low income in the territories in Inuit Nungangat, the Inuit traditional homeland, and on reserves. Results from this study showed that 14.6% of people in territories were living in low-income households in 2015. In Inuit Nungagat, 19.6% of individuals had a low income, and within this region, Nunavut had the largest rate at 22.1%, compared with 13% in Nunavik at the lower end. In 2015, 44% of the on-reserve population in Canada lived in low-income households. In comparison, 14.4% of the total population of Canada was considered to be living in low income households during the same period. The low income rates were lower for non Indigenous population than for all Indigenous identity groups in all geographic areas. The highest low income rates were found for First Nations living on reserve. Statistics Canada notes that according to the 2021 census, the poverty rate for Indigenous people, excluding First Nations people living on reserve, had fallen from 23.8% in 2015 to 11.8% in 2020. Additionally, the 2021 census had counted 1.8 million Indigenous people, which accounts for 5% of the total population living in Canada. And that was up from 4.9% in 2016. The Indigenous population grew by 9.4% from 2016 to 2021, surpassing the growth of non-Indigenous population over the same period by 5.3%. However, this growth was not as rapid as in years past. For example, from 2011 to 2016, the 5 previous years before the period examined, the Indigenous population grew by 18.9%, more than double the 2021 growth rate. For the first time ever, the census of population enumerated more than 1 million First Nations people living in Canada. The exact number was 1,048,405, according to Statistics Canada, 2022. Of over the 1.8 million Indigenous people living in Canada in 2021, those who reported being First Nations accounted for over half, at 58% of the Indigenous population, while just over one third, 34.5%, were Métis and 3.9% were Inuit. Ontario had the largest Indigenous population of all provinces and territories in 2021, with approximately over 400,000 people, which accounts for 2.9% of the provincial population. Additionally, of the 1.8 million Indigenous individuals living in Canada, there were over 600 First Nations represented in those numbers. The plurality of these groups representing Métis nationhood and 4 regions, as well as 50 communities of Inuit Nungangat. The Indigenous population living in large urban centers accounted for 800,000 people, which had grown by 12.5% from 2016 to 2021. The Indigenous population in Canada was 8.2 years younger than the average Canadian. However, Indigenous people were more likely than the non-Indigenous population to be living in a dwelling that was in need of major repairs or lived in a crowded housing situation in 2021. As well as 1 in 5 Indigenous people living in Canada around the same period that lived in a low-income household, using the low-income measure that Canada uses. This was down nearly 10% from 2016. And that decline was driven by government transfers in response to the global COVID-19 pandemic. Statistics Canada notes that Indigenous children account for 7.7% of all Canadian children aged 14 years or younger. Unfortunately, and as uncomfortable it is to discuss, Indigenous child poverty rates are much higher in Canada than the average child rate. In 2020, for instance, the poverty rates of children aged between 0 and 5 years old was below 10%. 6 and 10 years old hovered at around 8.5%. And for youth aged between 11 to 17 years of age, it was about 8%, which was all lower than their levels in 2015. However, we have to keep in mind that both higher payments from the Canadian Child Benefit, which was targeting at low and middle income families, plus income from the temporary pandemic relief benefits in 2020, they all contributed to significantly lowering the child poverty in Canada during the first year of the pandemic, while this census was taken. Accurate numbers, figures, statistics for the rest of 2020, 2021, and 2022 have not been released yet. Most alarmingly, Indigenous children suffer a poverty rate of 40% compared to the 15% of all other Canadian children. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives released in 2013 a report called Poverty or Prosperity: Indigenous Children in Canada. This report calculated child poverty rates in Canada and included the rates on reserves and territories, something that had never been done before. This report analyzed Canadian statistics and identified 3 tiers of poverty for children in Canada. The first tier excluded non-Indigenous, non-racialized, and non-immigrant children and had a poverty rate of about 12%. The second tier of child poverty did include racialized children. Those suffered a poverty rate of 22%. At 33%, first-generation immigrant children. Métis, Inuit, and non-First Nation children had a poverty rate of 27%. The final tier is perhaps the most shocking, but we've already seen the numbers. About half of First Nation children live below the poverty line, and that number rises to 60% for children who live on a reserve. A number of factors, including generational trauma and poverty, has affected Indigenous Canadian children in numerous ways. For instance, Indigenous children are overrepresented in Canada's foster care system. It is for that reason that in 2020, the Canadian government instituted an act representing First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and their families. This legislation sought to reduce the overrepresentation of Indigenous children and youth in the foster care system, and to improve child and family services to all Indigenous families. Of children in private households in 2021, Indigenous children were more likely to be in foster care than non-Indigenous children. Those numbers are 3.2% versus 0.2%. Altogether, Indigenous children accounted for over half of all children in foster care in Canada. Unfortunately and unacceptably, these numbers have not gone down but have gone up from the 2016 census, in which only 52.2% of Indigenous children were in care at that time. In 2003, New Ontarian stated that the poverty of First Nations in Canada has been the result of being stripped of their lands, their traditional livelihoods and cultures, and having been placed on less valuable lands as reserves, as well as a serious lack of educational opportunities, resulting in poverty, as we've discussed, unemployment, low rates of education, food and water insecurities, lack of housing or severe overcrowding in housing, lack of infrastructure for sanitation or power services, as well as higher rates of preventable diseases like heart attacks, strokes, asthma, diabetes, and tuberculosis. These factors lead to hopelessness, despair, and unfortunately the correspondent higher rates of violence, depression, and suicide amongst Indigenous people, especially their youth. Federal laws and policies have not only placed Indigenous peoples in their current state of poverty, but also keep them in this state, primarily due to the chronic underfunding of those essential services, which even Canada's own officials have called discriminatory. Yet, policymakers have been stumped for years, despite the fact that every major financial reports and statistics have indicated that smaller investments would have had a huge social and financial dividends later. For example, according to TMU, every $1 spent on Indigenous children now will save $7 later in social programs. Poverty, the Indigenous peoples, and statistical accuracy in Canada. The Tamarack Institute, founded in 2001, was established as an institute that would deeply understand how community change can happen and would help organizations and Indigenous citizens to work better together for a collective impact. The Tamarack Institute has two big goals. The first was to establish a learning center that would provide research and document real stories, exemplary practices, and effective applications for community change. The second was to apply what had been learned to end poverty. Since its inception, the Tamarack Institute has effectively helped more than 1 million Canadian households rise out of poverty, according to the Tamarack Institute's 2021 webinar called Indigenous Perspective on Poverty Reduction, available on their website in addition to their YouTube channel. A co-authored study by the Assembly of First Nations and the Canadian Centre for Policy and Alternatives in 2019 and 2020 analyzed reports and findings, including the household survey from Statistics Canada, plus the 2021 statistical information available, and determined that these numbers don't paint inaccurate pictures of Canada's Indigenous people's dire situation. These numbers are grossly underrepresented. These statistics are based on too small of a percentage to be representative of the real poverty crisis affecting Canadian Indigenous population. So all the numbers, all the statistics we've seen so far, the numbers are graver than they are or what they've been shown to us. These numbers are not accurate because in Canada, measuring poverty for Indigenous people is based on a technical definition of income and expenditure, and it doesn't allow for a multidimensional approach to understand poverty and its elimination. We can help by giving donations to food banks, clothing, food, to charitable events. We can be agents of change by stopping prejudices and discrimination in their tracks. Provincially, federally, territorially, we can be agents of change as well. We can be advocates and spread the word. Additional resources like calls to action or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are available to all of us to read and get informed. Knowledge is power. It's our turn. It's our chance to be knowledgeable and affect changes. Thank you.